is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 70 is Jungian analyst and voice dialogue facilitator Dianne Braden in Solon, Ohio. She holds a master's degree in Romance languages and literatures from the University of Michigan and a diploma in analytical psychology from the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. Ms. Braden is an independent licensed chemical dependency counselor with an extensive background in addictions treatment. She completed her analytic training at the C.G. Jung Analyst Training Program of Pittsburgh and has maintained a private practice in analytical psychology since 2000. She continued her studies in voice dialogue facilitation after completing her analytic training, and worked extensively and directly with Drs. Hal and Sidra Stone, the originators of voice dialogue and the psychology of selves. She is an active member and senior training analyst with the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, having served on their admissions, final exam, and training committees. She is also an affiliate member of the International Association for Analytical Psychology and a member of the local educational group Jung Cleveland. Ms. Braden is a visiting faculty member of the C.G. Jung Analyst Training Program of Pittsburgh and has presented unpublished papers in Cleveland, New York, and Kansas to both Jungian and psychoanalytic groups. In 2011, she edited the Fireside Chats, published by Drs. Hal and Sidra Stone. It includes a series of conversations they offered to senior practitioners of voice dialogue on life and death, the challenges and rewards of aging, relationship and psycho-spiritual growth, illness and health, the gift of dreams, and the ever-present golden thread of meaning in the evolution of personal and global consciousness. Ms. Braden is a past monitor in the Voice Dialogue International Dream Room and continues an active private practice in Jungian analysis and voice dialogue facilitation in the Cleveland area. Her book, The Path of Relationship, The Life and Work of Drs. Hal and Sidra Stone, published in 2018, continues the journey begun in the Fireside Chats, and it is the subject of our talk today. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com, where you'll find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, August 19th, 2020, through the magic of Skype. Hi, Dianne.
Hi, Laura.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
In the introduction to your book, you say you are a Jungian analyst and what that means to you. You write, Jung had a gift for understanding the psyche in a way that made sense to me. Would you say a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, we have lots of different kinds of training and lots of opportunities these days. And when it just seemed to me that when I was introduced to Jung and his way of seeing life and human beings, that suddenly something clicked for me. Mm-hmm. It's like reading the very right description of what you're experiencing. And so I've always been a really active dreamer. I mean, even as a child. And so I've had a connection with the unconscious that I never knew what to do with. I just thought I was a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And so everything fell into place.
In your private practice, you say you work with people's inner lives, their dreams, fantasies, and creative projects that yield meaning to a personal process of psychological growth. So you trained to become a Jungian analyst, but concurrently you were working with the Stones on their modality of voice dialogue. What is voice dialogue?
Voice dialogue is a tool, actually, that you can use to help people discover the reality of a life that goes on within us. It's an active tool. It's an engaging tool to introduce people to what it is to be human, to have many different parts, and bring all of those under one roof. So it dovetails so nicely with, I mean, of course, with Jungian theory, because Hal Stone was a Jungian analyst and had all of that training as well. And so it's a foundation. His Jungian training was a foundation for the work that eventually became voice dialogue. And voice dialogue is simply engaging in dialogue with the different parts of ourselves and making them conscious.
So let's talk a little bit about Hal and Sidra Stone, who you knew. Hal just recently passed away in May. You worked with them for many, many years. So how did you first discover them and their work?
I actually was introduced to it through a friend of mine who was a practitioner and worked and staffed for them in some of the intensives that they hosted out on the West Coast. And so I began to get interested in the work and curious. Mm-hmm. And so I began studying, I began reading, and then eventually I made the trek out to California. And I say it that way because Albion, where they live, is truly a pilgrimage. It's not just, a quick trip from the airport. So, but it ended up being a really, really important part of my training in my life.
And you were doing that while you were training to become a Jungian analyst?
I was nearing the end of my training when I actually started going independently to work with them. Mm-hmm. And they were just an enormous support. Analytic training is a very rigorous experience. I mean, as it should be. Working at that depth with people is a huge responsibility, I think, and so training should be careful and exact and deep and require of you what you're going to ask of other people. And so it was quite demanding, and I ended up working with them as a support through training.
Well, let's talk a little bit about them. And you mentioned that Hal was a Jungian analyst. He trained with the Jung Institute of Los Angeles. He also spent some time in Zurich, where he worked with C.A. Meyer and Marie-Louise von Franz, two of Jung's closest colleagues. But Hal, as he is known to be called, Hal, he actually resigned as a Jungian analyst. So would you tell us a little bit about his journey as an analyst?
Sure. Hal, I mean, one of the wonderful things about his story is that, he remained one of the sort of originals, one of the people who was able to meet Jung face to face.
Yes.
But I mean, it's such a great story of him meeting Jung.
Yeah, and that's in the book. Sorry to jump in, but that is a great story, and it is in the book, The Path of Relationship. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. And whatever you want to share, please.
I say in the book, I'm a sucker for training stories. And, when Jungian analysis came to this country, people were in analysis young. Hal was a young man, still in his 30s, when he decided to train and get involved in analysis and analytic work. And he signed up. He said he wrote Jung, the most amazing letter to try to get an audience with him when he was in Zurich. And, he landed one, and it's just an amazing. His whole trip to Zurich and that time was just a wonderful adventure. And he analyzed with Meyer and von Franz, and these are the big guns for those of us who are analysts now. I mean, these are the originals, because I didn't know anything about Jung, and he had died in 1961. I was still, in school. So to hear, stories like Hal's and how von Franz was unhappy with him. When he missed an appointment with her, he said she came to the door like a great dark cloud. That's just, I can't imagine being able to stand up straight if von Franz was mad.
Right.
So I was like, or, he goes into an audience with Jung and he's had a momentous dream about why he was really there and his father. And so he didn't really have anything to analyze with Jung because the dream had told him everything he needed to know, and Jung agreed. And so he said, there we sat, knee to knee. And he said to Jung, I just wanted an opportunity to see you. And Jung laughs and he says, well, then take a good look. Mm-hmm. And, I just can't imagine being knee to knee with a psyche of that size and depth. It's just so much fun to listen to. So he had, as an analyst, he had so many great experiences and also with the people in California, the analysts in California, and the opportunity of some of the early guys that he worked with. It's an amazing story, the experience he had. And then honestly, he completed whatever it was that drew him to Jung and to being a Jungian analyst and being part of the training. And, he says himself, he wished he could have done it with more grace and peace of mind, I guess. But he also says, look, you can do only as well as you can do. Mm-hmm. And so when he was done, he was done. And he left, not Jungian work, but he left the training program with some opinions about the length of time people are required to stay in analysis. And, he had some objections, some opinions. Mm-hmm. And so, and he honestly, as he continued to do for the rest of his life, it followed what he thought was his star and his journey. And he listened always to his connection with his dreams.
Hal eventually met Sidra Stone, who she was trained as a clinical psychologist. Would you say a little bit about her?
Well, Sidra, what is the ingredient Sidra? She is the depth of feminine to his depth of masculine. She's sensitive and gifted. She's one of the smartest women I've ever met. And she's a very gifted clinician. She's solid and wise. And she, at the time that they met, she didn't have the connection to the unconscious. She had experience, but not the connection that she eventually was introduced to through her relationship with Hal. Sidra had experience of unconscious material and dreams and visions, but she didn't have the connection and the language for it, which she ultimately got from Hal. And then together they began to explore the connection between them as the sort of motivating force of understanding. And so it became for them a path to consciousness. Their relationship became a path to consciousness.
And there are quite a few beautiful photos of the both of them at various stages in their lives in your book, separately and together. So how did they meet and come together? This was not a quick thing. This occurred over the course of several years, and it is a wonderful story. And we'll get into later how you did these interviews for the book. But would you say a little bit about their path to finding each other?
Well, Hal had been well known doing energy work and guided imagery, which was a popular technique in the 70s and 80s in California. And it was new. That period of time in the United States, and particularly on the West Coast, was really an explosive time in terms of exploring alternative healing methods and alternative work with people. And Hal became quite well known for doing guided imagery sessions with lots and lots of people. I mean, big audiences, 200-300 people. And so he was quite well known. And on a separate track, Sidra was doing some cave tripping, I think that's what it was. And so she was already interested in these kind of internal journeys that were becoming popular. And, she's wonderfully inquisitive, Sidra is. She's just on top of learning anything and everything that catches her attention. And so she actually went to Hal on the recommendation of a friend of hers to learn about guided imagery and guided meditation.
Well, she was a psychologist and she was working clinically as a psychologist when she met Hal, right?
Right. She was involved in that wonderful project, Hamburger Home, that she talks about in the book of helping adolescent girls who have sort of are at their last stop of getting their lives back together through the court system, and were referred there from the court system. And so she was very involved with that already, and in a small private practice.
And she saw something in Hal's work that she wanted to incorporate in her own?
Yes, she wanted to explore it because of the experiences she had had, cave tripping and those kinds of internal journeys. And she wanted, everybody was talking about what Hal was doing. He was quite well known. And so she was curious. She wanted to figure out what that was. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the first session that they had together, I mean, she had a journey that was just amazing. I mean, the depth and the images that came to her were just mind blowing. I mean, any analyst would hear them like a dream and think, oh my God, this woman can go beyond where most of us even imagine.
They became colleagues, and they were each married at the time, and they eventually found their way to each other and kind of blended their families and then started working together. And they've published many books together and videos and MP3s that can all be found on their website. I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. So let's talk about how and why you decided to tell their story.
Yeah, I've often wondered the same thing. One, because it was a very big project. But I also felt that I have an investment, I guess, ultimately, in honoring the people that go before us. And, the Stones individually and together cover a period of time in this country when there was no such thing as psychology. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was just sort of random work and there just was nothing. There was psychoanalysis that came from Europe, and there was nothing in this country that was being developed. And so the process of that and all of the, contortions and false starts and wrong directions that were part of coming into being in this country around mental health, I think are such interesting stories. And separately, I mean, Hal as becoming a Jungian analyst when it was so new in this country, and Sidra becoming a psychologist before women were allowed to do much of anything.
Yeah.
And so, their processes individually and together are, to me, fascinating. And I really think they deserve for stories like theirs to be preserved, because we're in an age where things are immediate and fast and accessible, and these guys walked through the fire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those stories have to be preserved. And so for me, both her story and Hal's story and theirs together is something worth saying.
And it's really a beautiful story of their relationship. And what I find interesting is that Sidra was born and grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and she was educated in New York City. And Hal was born in Detroit, and then he eventually wound up in Southern California. Sidra, through her first marriage, wound up in Southern California. So they were coming from different places, and Sidra trained in clinical psychology. I think she got her PhD from the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And then Hal got his PhD from UCLA in Los Angeles there, and then trained at the Jung Institute in Los Angeles. And then they were working at it, and they both have children from their first marriages. And so they were living this and experimenting and trial and error. And they eventually came up with this modality. And it is, along with the voice dialogue, there's something called the psychology of selves, which I love. Would you say a little bit about that? And that's something that they developed, right?
Right. The idea of multiplicity in the psyche is of course not new. And it wasn't new to Jung either. It was talked about in many ways. I have a section in the book where I sort of list the people who have identified multiple parts, multiple aspects of the human psyche. But the idea of a psychology of selves belongs to the Stones, and what they've identified is that we are, as human beings, made up psychologically of many different parts that handle different areas of our lives. And they identified these as selves because any one part sort of can function autonomously. It has its own worldview, its own ideas, its own expression, its own energy. And so they embodied these by identifying them as selves, and then begin to teach us about relationship to our individual selves as a task in order to help us find our balance going through life.
And how is this similar to Jung's work and his concept of the shadow? Because that's what I see in this, in talking to maybe our in voice dialogue, our disowned selves, the parts of us that are not in our conscious awareness, that we push away, that we don't like, that we don't want to identify with.
Right. And this is the beauty of Jung's work and the Stones' work, is that it introduces us to stuff that we don't know about ourselves. And so the promise is that when we've been introduced, we'll stop being destabilized by people who carry it. So what that means is that there are selves that I like and identify as who I am. And then on the other side, the understanding is, both Jungian and in voice dialogue, is that on the other side there is an opposite, and that we are actually psychologically made of opposites. And some we know about and some we don't. And so for the Stones, the disowned selves are those selves that we don't know anything about, but we recognize in other people. And for Jung, that is shadow. And so knowledge about that which we don't know is the point of analysis and work in voice dialogue and the psychology of selves.
So what is done in a voice dialogue session? You are a facilitator. Would you tell us a little bit about how that occurs? What happens?
A voice dialogue session is an actual dialogue. It's an actual conversation with another person and a variety of different selves. And the point of a facilitation is to separate selves from the central identity.
From the central identity.
Yeah. For instance, I would say, Laura, I'd like to speak, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak to the part of you that enjoys doing these interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would actually engage that part in conversation. What's your favorite part of it? What made it come to you? How often, how much do you like to do? Do you think Laura's doing a good job? That sort of thing. And then we would come back to you, and I might say, so I wonder on the other side, could I speak to the part of you that is kind of done with this?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't enjoy the work, is tired today, whatever. And so I would allow conversation and facilitate conversation with the other side who doesn't feel the same. Now, the advantage to that for you is to give you permission to find your balance so that you don't get over-identified with being an interviewer, or you don't someday just throw in the towel because the part of you that doesn't enjoy the work is sick of it. And so that you always have choice from the middle.
Because you know both sides.
Exactly. And it doesn't let you function as only a self. You have choice because you know both parts of you involved in this project.
So because I am on Twitter and social media a lot, I do see a lot of comments that I get or that people send me, and just kind of what else is out there. And I can already hear people saying, well, to acknowledge that you have all these different selves inside of you, isn't that pathological? Isn't that multiple personality disorder? So what is the difference?
Well, the difference is that you know that these are parts. You don't believe that any one self is you. The idea is that we're all under one umbrella. All of these parts are under one umbrella. And you know that. The difference is that in disorders like you're describing, dissociative disorders and identity disorders, there's no knowledge of the other parts. The parts think they are you.
Now, when you were describing the voice dialogue session, were you saying that this is sort of the persona that's in the middle?
No, I would say it's the operating ego. It's you who you know yourself to be, and then you also understand that there's a part of you that takes care of business, and then there's a part of you that loves to go on vacation. Mm-hmm. And we're not just one person all the time, but there is a central operating ego.
So where does the persona fit in, or is that not a term that's really used in this area?
It's a Jungian term, but it's a persona can be any particular self that interfaces with the world.
So any of those voices?
Sure. Depends on, we all have what's called a primary self. And a primary self is the one that, most often interfaces with the world, takes care of problems, takes care of you, in the sense that it takes care of your vulnerability. These primary selves are developed to take care of our ultimate vulnerability, and they protect us. And so they interface with the world most often. And then on the other side, of course, there's an opposite. But a persona would be any one self that interfaces with the world for us.
Mm-hmm. So how do people deal with when they realize that there is this opposite voice in them to what they're identifying with? So let's say, to use your example, I'm identified, and I'm not sure that's the right word, with doing these interviews, the part of me that likes to do these interviews. And then if I were to have this session with you where we talk to the part of me who doesn't enjoy it, who wants to quit, what happens when a person is kind of thrown by that and says, oh no, I have that in me too. And what do I do with that? Right.
And that's a great question, because it leads to the next description, which is what is hoped for, what the hoped for result is in a voice dialogue facilitation, is that a person is allowed to form an aware ego process between these two opposites. And what that means is that, which most people do, flip from one self to another self, to the opposite. As Jung says, the psyche will not tolerate radical imbalance. And so, the more identified you are on one side, the more at risk you are for a complete reversal, what Jung called an anti-andromia. And it throws you into the opposite side because you're out of balance. And so what voice dialogue does is, in talking to the two opposing parts, is that it gives you in the center the opportunity to stand the tension of the opposites, to hold both sides, the part that identifies with being an interviewer and the part that can't stand it. And so that you have an awareness first of both sides. And the longer you do that, then a new state is formed in which you're able to have a little bit of both. It's like I describe it as an energetic dial. And in any given situation, you can turn the dial up on one side because the job requires it, and down on another, and up on the other side when the job doesn't require it. And so you have agency in an aware ego process between any given pair of opposites. And Jung described this as the transcendent function of the psyche. And he too, says you have to tolerate the tension of the opposites until a new psychological attitude is formed, incorporating something of both.
And that doesn't typically just happen in one session. That's something that can take quite a bit of time.
Absolutely.
And be a struggle. And it's important to stay with that struggle.
Exactly. Because what most people do is between a pair of opposites is just flip, sort of randomly and dramatically from one side to the other, always being on one side or the other, and not tolerating the consciousness of both sides. And it's very hard work. It absolutely is. But the reward, is great.
How does your work with voice dialogue tie into your work as a Jungian analyst?
Well, I wouldn't say that I do voice dialogue regularly as part of analysis,
Okay.
although, the two are pretty seamless in a way. It's the same foundation. And so there are times when in a session I might spontaneously do a facilitation and say, just for the idea of let me talk to that part. Let's give that part a voice. It's quite Jungian. It's to think of it too as active imagination. The difference, voice dialogue, is that it's actual conversation. In active imagination, it's usually written and not necessarily shared with the analyst. But it's a similar process, and so I might spontaneously use it. I also find it useful as an alternative understanding of dream work, or when I work with couples. And I find that voice dialogue work very helpful working in couples.
So do other voice dialogue facilitators work that way as well, or is it something where you can find a voice dialogue practitioner and work with them just using voice dialogue?
Yes. In fact, most most people who do voice dialogue are not. I mean, I don't know any other analysts that do it. I mean, that I am essentially a Jungian analyst, and I also do work in voice dialogue. But there are a whole group of folks who are voice dialogue practitioners all over the country and all over the world. Their work has been internationally known for many, many years, and they have on their website, Voice Dialogue International, there's a directory of facilitators, and it's I mean, Hal and Sidra's hope was and continues to be is that the work become useful, that the work become a tool for many disciplines, and it's used in many disciplines, in business and in all kinds of therapies, and it's just that was the point. It isn't that people necessarily become, voice dialogue facilitators, which is why it didn't certify anybody. It's not that kind of a program. They offer it as a tool, and it's enormously useful. And so I'm just one kind of professional who uses voice dialogue, and I only use it because it dovetails so well with Jungian analysis, because that is in fact what I do.
Mm-hmm. In the book, the beginning of the book, you say that you wondered what kind of people make contributions to consciousness. And that seems to be the theme of the book, where you're asking that question and you're exploring it through a series of interviews with Hal and Sidra. You visited them up in Northern California, which your book is so beautifully written. The way you describe the scenery and the ambiance of the room or the outdoors or your drives, it's like I'm there. And there's this really beautiful picture that you took. It's a photograph that is the cover of the book. And you can see that'll be on this episode page at speakingofjung.com. So you made a series of trips, of visits to their house, and you would fly into San Francisco airport, and then it was about a 3.5-hour drive north. Is that right?
Yes.
That is a long journey, and not an easy one either. So tell us about that process that you went through to do these interviews, to write this book.
Yeah. It was such a privilege, really. I love that I started with that question. It was my motivation. It was like, who does this sort of thing?
Yeah.
What kind of people are called, and what are they made of? I mean, the Stones were always very open about their lives and their relationship, but to get behind the scenes and to really, say what formed you, what made you who you are, and how'd you get here? That was fascinating to me, and so they were so gracious, because I honestly hadn't done anything like this before. And so, on the other side, of course, I now think, gosh, if I had known that, it would have taken a year less, or maybe 2. But, they were so wonderful in giving me time. And I really just came out and said, please just tell me your story. Mm-hmm. And it was delightful. They are delightful. And to me, I began to see, what kind of people do contribute to consciousness. And, it's not a picnic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of life that has to happen, and a lot of trial, and a lot of agony and ecstasy. And, and what was so wonderful about them is that they tell the truth. Mm. They don't dress it up. They don't say, well, the clouds parted and the sun came out and everything just, the leaves fell in a neat little pile. I mean, it wasn't like that. And they didn't hold back about, the pain it caused people, the lives they touched, and the stuff they went through. I mean, it's just a real story. and it's a love story. I mean, who doesn't like that?
Yeah. Yeah. So you had been to their house in Albion before for training? I'm sorry, what were those called?
They're called, they ran regular intensives.
Intensive, okay.
And I actually had more training individually with them. I did go to an intensive, and they're really interesting group experiences, and the opportunity to be facilitated by a variety of people, as well as the Stones. But I'm quite introverted by nature, and so I ended up doing almost all of my work with them individually, and all of my training with them. And the way they work is interesting. That you go for a week, and you would be facilitated maybe 3 days by Hal and 2 days by Sidra, or the opposite, and then you stay in one of the apartments on the property, or at a hotel. I mean, over the years there were all kinds of things, and you work intensively with them for 2.5 hours in a session, and then you're on your own for the afternoon, and you come back the next morning. And I did that twice a year for many years, and was in touch with them, of course, in between. And this was all before the book was even an idea.
Mm-hmm. And then you decided to tell their story, so you went back for actual interviews with them, and where you sat down, just the two of you. You interviewed them separately.
I did.
And they told their stories, and they're all in this book, this beautiful book. It's so beautifully written, Dianne.
Thank you so much.
I do want to mention to the listeners, Dianne and I actually know each other. You were my analyst for many, many years, and I remembered you going to California, but I didn't know what you were doing. And you'd say you were going for a week at a time, and I thought, wait a minute, where are you going? So now I know more about what those trips were about, and I didn't know until I read your book. And you also share some stories about yourself in this book, which I loved reading because I didn't know. Another thing that is kind of a recurring theme in the book is what you call spirit of place.
Yeah, it's such how do you talk about spirit? How do you talk about anything that's invisible? It's such a challenge. What I think is that there are certain of us, and many of us that don't know how to identify it, who are quite sensitive to the energy that a certain place carries.
Yes.
It's the way you feel when your feet touch the ground. It's the way your soul breathes in a certain way at a certain depth, just because of the place you're standing in, or the place you're sleeping in, or I actually wrote a chapter in a book of Mark Winborn's called Shared Realities.
Mm-hmm.
And I write specifically about the energy of place and an experience I had in Kauai. But I have always felt going to the Stones' house in Albion that there is an energy of the place that is communicated, and it opens the soul. I mean, there's a peace and a depth and an energy that comes from them, the land, and it's right on the coast. You can see the ocean, you hear the foghorn. I mean, and these giant trees. It's just it's evocative of human depth and being held by something. It's a connection.
Yeah, you talk about how deeply geographical roots attach in the psyche, and also the importance and the unavoidable impact of birthplace, the place we were born. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not as articulate as some about that, but there is a groundedness that happens when one returns to the place of one's birth. Even if the story attached to that place is not a happy one, but there is an instantaneous recognition deep in the soul of this is where I started. And I mean, for me, I feel even though I'm often resistant to being from the Midwest, that where I was born, it gives me a certain groundedness that the East and West Coast carry in such an extreme way, and I feel rooted in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I do attribute that to being Midwestern, even though I'm sometimes critical of that as being somewhat unenlightened. But no offense to people who love the Midwest. And I've been here, God knows, forever.
Yeah, I was born in New York City, and I noticed when I returned there, of course, the area I'm from looks so different now. But whenever I go back, I could physically feel something in my body. So this section on bonding patterns in chapter 12 is some of the best material I have ever read. And so it truly is. And I was wondering, it's not a term that I hear frequently. So would you tell us briefly, what is a bonding pattern?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things about the Stones' work that are really brilliant, but I think the bonding pattern is probably one of the most outstanding ideas of understanding a human relationship. And the idea of the bonding pattern is that in relationship, there is, for human beings, there is sort of one model, which is parent-child. That's all we have. And so they talk about bonding patterns as the meat of understanding unconscious processes between people, meaning that in relationship, somebody is always on some level the child or the parent, and that the interactions that become problematic or dramatic or even successful often have to go through that phase of understanding that we often connect as a parent-child relationship. And the beauty of that is that when we find ourselves in relationship having the same difficulty over and over again, the same fight with the same words, with the same same drama, and absolutely nothing gets resolved. Those are bonding patterns, and it's guaranteed that psychologically and internally somebody is the child and somebody is the parent until it gets painful enough that they switch roles, and then and then you start all over again. And the reason it doesn't get resolved is because bonding patterns are unconscious. And so the work of voice dialogue, and this is what is so outstanding for couples work, is that it makes those bonding patterns conscious. And suddenly you're not in it anymore. It only takes only one person has to become conscious that they're in a bonding pattern, and you're out of it. But and they're amazing teachers, these bonding patterns. Hal and Sidra talk about them as the best educational tool that the universe has ever come up with to help human beings. You learn so much about yourself and how you operate in relationship if you understand bonding patterns. And so there are positive bonding patterns, which is, everybody makes nice and nobody deals with negativity and nobody rocks the boat. And pretty soon the relationship sort of begins to get dull and boring, and eventually sort of dies because there's no excitement, there's no conflict. And then there are negative bonding patterns, which are often terribly painful and destructive, and but really wake us up to the idea that we need to find a way to deal with negativity in relationship that doesn't destroy relationship. And if you're aware of bonding patterns, that is the salvation of many, many relationships that go south.
Yes, and I can attest to that. You used the word conflict. Would you say a little bit about the necessity or the importance or the value, just in general, of conflict?
Sure. I often feel like I'm selling a product that's hard to sell because I feel like I'm, promoting people fighting, but
right.
But in reality, it's unavoidable that there's conflict in relationship. There's always two people in a space big enough for one, and people fall apart when there's no reliable and efficient way to deal with conflict because you can't avoid it. And so what I do as an analyst or in voice dialogue facilitation is I help people find a way to deal with negativity because you can't avoid it. And so I do think people should fight, but they should fight in a way that doesn't destroy things. There have to be rules. There have to be, the idea of not hitting below the belt because you know someone well, or, and so often in relationship, it isn't really what you say, it's who in you is saying it. And you can say some very difficult things if it comes from a place in you that is kind. And so you can't let, a 300-pound primary self that is defending, that is a protector and sees everybody as an enemy. You can't let them deliver the message to your husband that, you wish he'd lose a few pounds because, he'll destroy him. You have to, these are legitimate conversations to have between spouses, but you have to do it from a place that understands how hurtful it can be to talk about negative things.
You explain those things so well, and I would love to do an episode with you where I just ask you to explain things because you do it unlike any other. So Hal Stone passed away recently, and because of this pandemic, his memorial service was held virtually, and it was attended by hundreds of people, and you spoke. Your book was published 2 years ago, so Hal got to see the book finished.
My biggest fear in writing the book, because it took so many years to finish. My biggest fear was that he would die before I got the book finished. No pressure, just
right.
I would just say to him, "Okay, don't die. I'm not done yet."
Oh,
yeah. he was. And he would laugh.
Okay.
Oh, I'm still here. And they never pressured me. Hal never did, and we all just said, gently, "How's the book coming?" So I'm so glad that he got to see it, and that it's also such a tribute to Sidra, that the work they've done is so meaningful and deep, and many people didn't know her story as well. So when Hal died, and his daughter called me and asked me if I would speak, I was, of course, enormously honored. And, just the idea of, there were like almost 500 people from all over the world on this Zoom memorial service. And, it was an honor to speak, and it was difficult and emotional, and because and you could feel so many people loved him.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people have been impacted by their work and their lives and their loving hearts. And so I was honored. I was afraid I wouldn't get through it without crying, and I almost made it. But it was an honor, Laura.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say about it except that it was a last chance to say goodbye.
Mm-hmm. One of the quotes in the book, something that Hal said to you, he said, "Unless something speaks to my heart, my soul in some way, I just don't have interest in it." And I love that, and I'm going to use that because, I don't want to spend time on things that I'm not feeling and don't touch me in that way. So I feel like he gave me permission to say no to some things, because unless something speaks to my heart or my soul, I just don't have interest in it.
He was such a great model of that. If he taught nothing else, he taught, do not waste time on things that do not belong to you.
Mm.
And he kept going and exploring and opening. And, one of the things I love the most about what Hal and Sidra both do is their honesty about the aging process and looking into the future and what's beyond us, and not wasting time on things that either involve people that are not your tribe, or attaching to things that don't belong to you. And it's a hugely important lesson. If there's one thing I think that is also such a big connection with Hal and Sidra's work, and Hal personally, is his dedication to following his dreams and his dream life, and how voice dialogue can be an added tool to understanding dreams, how different selves are represented in dreams, and how the unconscious, Hal would say, not how the unconscious guides us, but how the universe guides us through dreams and our understanding of dreams. And, he actively dreamt right up to the last minute of his life. And, a day or two before he died, he was talking about a dream to Sidra, as I mentioned in his memorial. And, his dedication and his primacy of staying connected with the unconscious and staying connected to the universe through our dreams was so important. And it's a legacy, certainly, that lines up with Jung and Freud. And, there's so many ways. There's one unconscious and so many ways to address it. And I feel that Jung and Hal Stone and Sidra Stone bear allegiance to something so vital that I would certainly want that to be shared.
Thank you, Dianne.
You're welcome.
Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device, simply by saying, "Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts," or TuneIn. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. With eternal thanks to my guest, Dianne Braden, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.